You are testing to see if the mean speed of your cable internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second. So we're going to start by identifying our null hypothesis and our alternative hypothesis. We're going to start that by using the correct symbol. We indicate our null hypothesis with h sub 0. The word null here means empty or nothing. And so we use the 0 to indicate that. And of course the h is for hypothesis. And the alternative hypothesis is indicated by h sub a. And of course the a here stands for alternative. Okay? So to actually write what these hypotheses are, we need to go back here. We are testing to see if the mean speed of our cable internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second. Okay? So mean speed. We indicate mean, the population mean, with the letter mu, right? And in this case, we want to see if that mean, if that mu is more than 18 megabits per second. So how would we do more? Well, more is greater than 18 megabits per second. Be careful here. You don't want to say greater than or equal to. If you're ever uncertain, just plug in the number 18 into the inequality and see if it makes sense. Is 18 more than 18? Well, no. So having a greater than or equal to doesn't make sense because we want our mu to be more than 18, right? In this problem statement, we use the word more. So this is going to be one of our hypotheses. Our other hypothesis, since we have no more additional information, that's all they gave us, our other hypothesis is just going to use the opposite symbol in the middle. So if we're not greater than, then we would be less than or equal to, right? And so these are our hypotheses. These are going to be our two hypotheses. But we still have to decide which is our null hypothesis and which is our alternative hypothesis. So if we look at the textbook, we have a lovely chart here that kind of breaks it down for us. And the key here to identifying which is your null and which is your alternative hypothesis is that the null hypothesis always has a symbol with an equal in it. So that could be the equal symbol, or it could be greater than or equal to, or it could be less than or equal to. So whichever equation or inequality has that symbol, has a symbol with an equal in it, that's your null hypothesis. On the other hand, your alternative hypothesis never has a symbol with an equal in it. So that means it could be using a not equal to symbol, a less than symbol, or a greater than symbol. Okay? So now look back at our hypotheses. We immediately identify, oh, this first guy here has a greater than or equal to. I'm sorry, a less than or equal to. So it has that or equal to, it has an equal to symbol, so this must be our null hypothesis. Okay? Whereas here, we have a greater than. There's no equal to in it, so this has got to be our alternative hypothesis. Okay? So those are our hypotheses. Let's put those in. So our null hypothesis is that the mean, not the population proportion, the population mean is less than or equal to, so I'll choose the less than or equal to symbol from the drop-down menu, 18 megabits per second. And the alternative hypothesis is just the opposite. The mean is greater than 18 megabits per second. Okay? All right. So now that we have our hypotheses, we want to make sure we can identify our type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay, so a good place to start, we have 4 options here. A good place to start is identifying which of these are actually errors. So for example, the first one here, you decide that the mean speed of your internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second, when in reality the mean speed of your internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second. Notice our decision matches the reality. Well, that's not an error. We've come to the correct conclusion. So it couldn't possibly be, our type 1 error couldn't possibly be our first option here because it's not an error. So let's look at option 2. You decide the mean speed of your internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second when in reality the speed of your internet connection is not more than 18 megabits per second. Now this is an error because we make a decision that it is more than 18 megabits per second, but in reality it is not more than 18 megabits per second. Our conclusion differs from reality, and so we have made an error. So option 2 is a possibility for our type 1 error. Okay? Looking at option 3, we decide the mean speed is not more than 18 megabits per second, when in reality the mean speed is not more than 18 megabits per second. So option 3 here, option 3 is not an error. We make a conclusion, it matches reality. In option 4, we conclude that the mean speed is not more than 18 megabits per second, when in reality the mean speed is more than 18 megabits per second. So option 4 is an error. So the only two possibilities here, once we take out the correct conclusions, is option 2 and option 4. Those are the only ones that are errors, so they are the only options that could be a type 1 error. Okay? So now that we have limited it to those two choices, options 2 and option 4, let's recall what a type 1 error is. And so again, I'm referencing the textbook because these are easy to mix up. A type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually true. So the decision is to reject the null hypothesis. So let's start that. Let's make sure that we want the case where we reject the null hypothesis. So let's look at this. So here, the decision is, in option 2, we decide that the mean speed of the internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second. So the null hypothesis is that the mean is less than or equal to 18, so that's not saying that it's more. The alternative hypothesis is that the mean is more than 18 megabits per second. Okay, so in other words, we decide that we're going to accept the alternative hypothesis, which means we are rejecting the null hypothesis. And that's what we want here, right? We want a decision where we reject the null hypothesis. Okay? When in reality, the speed of your connection is not more than 18 megabits per second. So if you're not more, then that means you are less than or equal to. So in reality, the mean speed is less than or equal to 18 megabits per second. The mean speed is not more than 18 megabits per second. In reality, the null hypothesis is true. Okay? So this guy is saying that we're rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is actually true. And that's exactly what a type 1 error is. We're rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is actually true. Okay? So our type 1 error is option 2 here. Okay? So now let's identify our type 2 error. So the first thing I want to point out is that the order for your type 1 error and your type 2 error is the same. And since the type 2 error is still an error, we can still rule out option 1 and option 3 because they are not errors. Okay? Option 2 we just used, so it's probably a pretty safe bet that we would want option 4. Option 4 is the only error we haven't used yet. So let's make sure that's the case. So option 4, you decide that the mean speed of your internet connection is not more than 18 megabits per second. So mean speed is not more than 18 megabits per second. That's the same as saying the mean is less than or equal to 18. Less than or equal is the same as not more. So we are not rejecting the null hypothesis. Okay? When, in reality, the speed of your internet connection is more than 18 megabits per second. So in reality, the mean speed is more than 18 megabits per second. So that would be, in reality, the alternative hypothesis is true, which means in reality, the null hypothesis is not true, it's false. Okay? So for option 4 here, we are not rejecting the null hypothesis, when in reality, the null hypothesis is false. And a type 2 error is exactly that. We do not reject the null hypothesis, when in reality, the null hypothesis is actually false. So option 4 here is a type 2 error.